And good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for the late delay, but we're glad you're still here because it's going to be a great talk by Dave Pitlyk from the Battle of Bennington historic site down in Hoosick, New York. And that's my introduction.
All right,
so let's get to it. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
All right. So my intent today is to provide an overview of some of the common and occasionally quite persistent myths that cling to the Battle of Bennington. I've delivered this same lecture elsewhere, and folks have made the observation that it seems a little negative. Well, my intent is not to be negative. I am a booster of the battle, obviously, in my role with New York State Parks. But rather, my intent is to be a little critical and to share sort of that critical habit of mind with folks who listen to this presentation. So just always, whenever you're reading a secondary source, of course, take it with a grain of salt. And the same can even be said for primary sources. You're only getting one piece of the puzzle, right? So I've got a few examples which I'll explore in depth, and towards the end of the lecture we'll go into sort of a rapid fire mode, and I'll provide a briefer survey of some other myths. But I hope you enjoy this presentation. It is informative. It is fun. It's actually one of my favorites to deliver. And without further ado, I'll just dive in here. So, my first myth that I'd like to explore is one of a more recent vintage. This is something that, as far as I can tell, was birthed recently in the form of this particular book, which you may have seen on certain shelves.
We can't see it.
You may have seen this with Musket and Tomahawk. This is widely carried in a number of gift shops.
I've seen that.
Yeah. So many myths surrounding the battle were established in the 19th century. But we're going to begin today with one that started in 2009. So I'm going to read a rather salacious, a rather shocking account from this book, and then we're going to consider how it might have come to be. So this is from page 203 of With Musket and Tomahawk. So, quote, "Deep in the wilderness, Catherine Esther Montour, the Witch of the Wilderness, was having a momentous time. Half intoxicated and armed with a tomahawk, she danced around a circle of 16 prisoners who lay on the ground with their hands and feet bound firmly with a rope. Nearby lay her son. Shortly before, he had passed out from the massive amount of alcohol he had consumed. Laughing insanely and chanting a weird sort of death song, she hopped and skipped around the condemned. Then it began, and I'll spare you some of the more gory details, but suffice to say it is quite gory. She begins dispatching her prisoners. Somehow, during this gruesome ordeal, 2 of her victims managed to escape, but that had been previously arranged by Catherine. She wanted them to get away. After running wild-eyed in terror through the woods, they would eventually return to their unit or area of residence. There they would spread fear while recalling in horror how the Witch of the Wilderness slaughtered those whom she regarded as traitors. Arising in the morning, Thomas Mellon began to move around. He noted numerous bodies nearby. Along with some others, he began to search for his unit. Entering the forest, they groped their way forward. It was here that Mellon and the others came across the bodies. Wow, so what a gripping account, right? we may wonder, well, what if we're reading a serious history? How can a witch figure in? So there is a legend. Advance the slide here. There is a legend that a Queen Esther of the Seneca, daughter of Catherine Montour, massacred prisoners taken in action with Butler's Rangers at the Battle of Wyoming, fought in Pennsylvania a little less than a year after the Battle of Bennington. So there is Catherine Montour, anyway. Historian William Max Reed wrote at the turn of the century in the Mohawk Valley, its legends and its history. It is said that 16 of the prisoners were ranged in a circle around a large stone and held there by a large number of Indians. This little party had been assigned to Queen Esther. Striking up a chant, she passed from one victim to the next, and with the death maul, etc., sparing you the details, two escaped by making a sudden dash through the lines and fled to the woods, finally escaped to safety. So, okay, so there is a completely unrelated, possibly historical figure. You'll notice I'm quoting from a book entitled Legends in part, right? But where exactly does the witchcraft enter into all this? And what is the connection, if any, with the Battle of Bennington or Saratoga? There was a so-called Witch of Saratoga. However, her name was Angeline Tubbs, but details of her life are highly fictionalized. William Stone writes in Reminiscences of Old Saratoga, just north of the village of Saratoga Springs rises a bald promontory of rock called Mount Vista, the gray masses of which impend frowningly over a deep glen beneath. Near the base of the mountain at this point and within the ravine, in a lonely and wretched hovel, lived a few years since a female of mysterious and uncertain character by name Angeline Tubbs. Surrounded by a numerous brood of cats, her sole companions, she led a solitary life at home and was considered a vagrant abroad, subsisting in part by mendicity and in part by laying small contributions upon those simple-hearted and prurient rustic maidens who wished to peep far enough into futurity to learn something of their future husbands. A rather florid way of saying she was a fortune teller, right? So, a fanciful tale credited to William Stone and later published in the Saratogian newspaper in the latter half of the 19th century provides an account of her as an old crone, desperate to extend her already unnaturally long life. She was supposed to have been a girl of 15 at the time of Burgoyne's invasion, and she was said to have been over 100 at the time of her death, perhaps in 1865. So here we have two figures, the conflation of which and the mingling with the factual account of Thomas Mellon, who is actually a known veteran of the Battle of Bennington, and did in fact observe the burials of loyalists on the battlefield, is rather startling. This doesn't seem like an innocent mistake. Here what we have is seemingly a willful misrepresentation meant to add some color to the author's account of the battle, which I'm sorry to report is already shot through with error. This is a popular book, and time will tell if the Witch of the Wilderness will enter the canon of legends of the Battle of Bennington. So this is actually supposedly a photo of Angeline Tubbs, and this is a painting of the actual battle where that supposed massacre took place. Moving on, the next myth I'd like to discuss is that of bombs gold. As you can imagine, people's ears often perk up when gold is mentioned, right? So we're going to consider this. There are a few mentions of this story in print. It is, in large part, sort of an oral tradition kept alive locally. But we will consider what the sources say about this concept of bombs gold. We do have an account collected by Asa Fitch, which seems to be the first written record of this rumor. Fitch was a historian of Washington County who may be familiar to some in this room, who conducted a staggering number of interviews with residents of the area in the 1840s and beyond. In his notes, he records, quote, Esquire Shippard says that William Robb of Petersboro, New Hampshire, was one of the men who carried Colonel Baum off from the battlefield at Bennington. Shippard, when a youth, was a neighbor to Captain Robb, and has often heard from him a minute relation of the circumstances. Robb was a private in General Stark's regiment. He and 3 others placed the wounded Hessian commander on a litter formed of a blanket with 2 poles tied to its sides. They carried him to a house which stood about where the Matthews house now stands. He spoke English and talked with them on the way and thanked them kindly for carrying him so carefully. The men felt a strong sympathy and attachment to the wounded colonel in consequence of his affable manners and discourse. What his wounds were, the Esquire does not recollect, but the men who carried him had no suspicions that his wounds were mortal or even dangerous. He was dressed in a most costly uniform, with a sword heavily mounted with gold, and they deposited him in the house with all his accoutrements upon him. The next morning he was found dead in the house, and stripped of every vestige of anything valuable. The men who carried him from the field heard this with surprise and deepest indignation, and were ever after open in expressing their belief that the wounded officer had been most foully dealt by, that he had been murdered for the sake of his clothes, sword, purse, etc., and it used to be said that the inhabitants of the house were in much better circumstances after this than they had ever been before. But there was such a crowd and so much confusion about the house and the neighborhood in the night after the battle that it was impossible to obtain any clue as to what had become of Baum's sword, etc., and no formal investigation was therefore gone into. So obviously the sword is a little more prominent in this account, but there is mention of a purse, right? Perhaps with gold coins. One version of this story, cited in the National Register listing for the State Line House, otherwise known as the Matthews House, has it that Matthews helped himself to a total of 3,000 gold coins. That's the only place I've ever seen it actually quantified. Other traditions hold that the gold is still out there somewhere waiting to be discovered. The standard version of events makes some assumptions that we should address. Actually, I will just advance the slide to show you Baum's ultimate, I guess you'd say, resting place. He was interred in an unmarked grave, but he did pass away in a log cabin. So, the first assumption that the expedition traveled with solid coin. There does seem to be some evidence for this. In August 13th letter to Burgoyne, Baum floats the idea, for example, of purchasing some horses taken by his native warriors. So he must have had coin on hand to do that. But things start to unravel from there. We know that Baum had been looted prior to his transport to the Matthews cabin, and that he spoke no English. Where he might have hidden 3,000 coins on his person, I'll leave that to you to determine. So, quoting now from an actual eyewitness to the battle, the surgeon Julius Wasmus, quote, "On this road we came past Lieutenant Colonel Baum, who was lying completely naked on the cart. He was shot through the abdomen and was crying and begging that the cart should go slow, but the men did not understand our language. Consequently, crying and begging were of no use. They speedily went to the parish of Bennington, where the cart stopped at a house. We helped him from the cart, took him into the house, where we had to lay him on a dirt floor. Since the regimental surgeon also came by, it was the lieutenant colonel's orders that he or I, one of us, should stay with him. The time had come, however, that his orders were no longer to be followed. The guard took us from him by force, shaking hands with us. He said goodbye and still charged me and the regimental surgeon with several messages for our General Dazel and also for a person in the homeland. So obviously the two accounts can't both be true. One potential explanation for the discrepancies between the former and the latter possibly might be a case of mistaken identity. And I will credit a member of our friends group, Phil Holland, for suggesting this to me. If the man carried on the litter was in fact Franz or Francis Pfister, portions of this secondhand story do become plausible. Pfister was a local loyalist, an ethnic German, but served as an officer and engineer in the British Army. If this indeed was the case, his appearance, manners, master of English would make sense. It is still difficult to imagine, however, that whatever coins he had on his person would have been sufficient to transform the fortunes of the Matthews family. Complicating matters further, Baum himself would have not been directly responsible for procurement and supply. That task was actually delegated to Philip Skeen, serving as Commissioner of Supplies. So earlier in the campaign, he had specific orders to that effect. He was also told to issue receipts for everything that was procured. So Baum was simply not directly involved in that process. It's also worth noting that 3,000 gold coins would have been a rather princely sum at this time. Presumably, the coins in question were gold guineas worth 21 shillings, or a little more than £1 sterling. To place that in some context, the average annual income in the colonies before the Revolution was about 14 pounds. During the war, Burgoyne's army was able to purchase a pound of tea, another little price point for you, from a sutler for 1 shilling 6 pence. If Matthews had been able to spend his ill-gotten windfall, he presumably would have had a little something better to show for it than a brick house. So the most likely explanation for all this is that suspicion of Matthews' loyalty in the years following the war colors these stories. While it does appear that the Vermont Council of Safety set a watch on him and that the estate of his son-in-law was taken, he was never formally charged or named in any act of attainder. He was never forced to flee the state. David Matthews, with 1 T, appears as an enlisted man under the land bounty rights roster of the Charlotte County Militia, suggesting he probably served as a patriot. The simplest explanation here might be that a different David Matthews served as the Crown's mayor in New York City. And so the David Matthews of the Battle of Bennington fame gets confused with him, and so any of his subsequent prosperity has to be painted with a sinister brush. All right. We move on to a favorite account of early historians of the battle. I've heard this pronounced variously as the Glick account or the Glitch account. I'll be going with Glitch today. It doesn't matter. He's a fictional person anyway. This is something that if you're reading histories even today, it is still occasionally cited. So I'm going to read some of it. It's rather expansive. It covers quite a bit of the battle. It's written beautifully. You can see the appeal, why people would want to cite it. I'll just read a portion of it just to give you a little bit of the flavor. And we'll begin sort of in the middle of the action here. It was at this moment when the heads of columns began to show themselves in rear of our right and left, that the Indians, who had hitherto acted with spirit and something like order, lost all confidence and fled. Alarmed at the prospect of having their retreat cut off, they stole away, and after their own fashion in single files, in spite of the strenuous remonstrances of Baum and of their own officers, leaving us more than ever exposed by the abandonment of that angle of the entrenchments which they had been appointed to maintain. But even this spectacle, distressing as it doubtless was, failed in affleeting our people with a feeling at all akin of despair. So this is obviously an account from the perspective of the Crown forces. I'm going to skip ahead to a very exciting part here. So continuing on with the account. Though repeatedly assailed in front, flank, and rear, we maintained ourselves with so much obstinacy as to inspire a hope that the enemy might even yet be kept at bay till the arrival of Brayman's corps, now more momentarily expected. When an accident occurred, which at once put an end to this expedition and exposed us almost defenseless to our fate. The solitary tumbrel, which contained the whole of our spare ammunition, became ignited and blew up with a violence which shook the very ground under our feet and caused a momentary cessation in firing, both on our side and that of the enemy. But the cessation was only for a moment. The American officers, guessing the extent of our calamity, cheered their men to fresh exertions. So, I can actually show you a video. So this was shared with me and later digitized. This is a reenactment, I believe, on the Vermont side of the border, around the 1970s. They actually detonated a tumbrel. I don't think we do that today. Our black powder procedures really are a little more strenuous, but it is interesting, right? So we have your typical account of the battle with, as I said, some very good detail, including this detonation. So this account has a long history. It was cited as early as 1848 in Butler's addresses on the Battle of Bennington and the life and services of Colonel Seth Warner. It was enshrined in the Vermont Historical Society proceedings of 1870. In fact, the account is cited but not quoted in a recent book on the Saratoga Campaign, The Complete Victory. There's only one problem, as I sort of suggested earlier as we begun. The account's a complete work of fiction. And I don't mean this is something that was inserted into history as fiction. I mean it was popular entertainment. And what's even worse, as early as 1905, this was known. The president of the Vermont Historical Society at the time, George Greenville Benedict, served notice that this was bunk. Quote, a few years ago, the discovery was made that the Glick narrative had been taken bodily from an English novel. The author of the novel was Reverend George Robert Gleig, an English clergyman who was in the British service in this country in the War of 1812 and afterward wrote a series of tales of military life which were published in 3 volumes in England in 1829 under the title of The Chelsea Pensioners. The tales are for the most part yarns of adventures and fighting and escapes which some old pensioners tell to wide-eyed auditors to rouse wonder and pass away the time. So this was actually collected by a historian, brought back without proper context, and it just started getting inserted into our histories. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. It's been quoted so many times and so recently. This one will be tough to get rid of. All right. That brings us to the Stockbridge native warriors in the battle, typically referred to in older secondary sources as the Stockbridge Indians, today the Stockbridge Munsee, right? This is something this is a myth that is actually enshrined at our very own battlefield. So if you visit the battlefield, the monument for the Berkshire Militia actually shows, if you look at this detail to the right, native warriors rushing into combat with Patriot soldiers. So obviously this is nothing, it's, if not etched into stone, it's at least cast into bronze, right? So this is another tricky one. So the written word is not the only way for legends to spread. In fact, there are at least a couple falsehoods that have, as I said, been immortalized at the battlefield. The most prominent relates to the Stockbridge tribes. A little context: in 1738, the first European mission was started in the Mohican village of Wenatchcook. The settlement was later renamed to Stockbridge. Other tribes from a wide area joined the Mohicans, and the new blended community was simply referred to, in common parlance, as the Stockbridge Indians. They were well known for supporting the Americans during the Revolutionary War. After the war, it must be said, the Stockbridge tribes faced repeated removals west. Today they refer to themselves as the Stockbridge Munsee and have a significant community in Wisconsin. A monument to the Berkshire Militia stands at the battlefield. It was created by a gentleman, William Gordon Huff. Huff actually studied sculpture in Paris, and upon returning to the United States, moved to Bennington, Vermont. So we actually had a Paris-trained artist creating some of the monumental art at the battlefield. He was the natural choice to artistically render the attack of the Berkshire Militia. The marker was dedicated in 1931 and was Huff's second major commission. He would go on to explore natural and native themes in his work, notably winning the contest to depict Chief Solano for California State Parks. His inclusion of natives could actually be seen as unusually an open-minded detail for the time. His work's impressive, conveys a scene of action and urgency, but did the native warriors actually charge into battle? Many in Massachusetts thought so. In a centennial observance of the anniversary of the battle, so that would be 1877, they were named specifically as having participated. Quote, "Who were these Berkshire men who gave Massachusetts the claim I have heard asserted by only one man here today to share the glories of this battle? Why, sir, the order of the day has limited them to 150. We think he is mistaken. Our traditions claim that there were 250 to 300, including a few Stockbridge Indians. And they came from Williamstown, Lanesboro, Hancock, Pittsfield, Richmond, Stockbridge, and other places, and were commanded by Colonel Simons of Williamstown and Lieutenant Colonel Rossiter of Richmond. They were made a part of General Stark's reserve, destined to face the enemy's cannon, assail the Tory breastwork, and pass at the bridge in front." That speech is actually a little bit ahead of its time. So the Western Massachusetts militia regiments were typically undercounted in most histories of the battle until relatively recently. It's possible, this is on the high end, but it is possible as many as 800 might have participated in the battle. So, in this instance, when we're talking about the Native American warriors, not only do we have their approximate numbers, we're given the names of the men who took command over them, and even their place in the order of battle at the time of the battle. The level of detail in this reference seems to lend it weight, and it's been repeated. But unfortunately, we do have a very simple smoking gun that disproves this assertion entirely. So, letter dated the 26th of August, 1777. Please keep in mind the battle was fought the 16th. So, from Timothy Edward to General Gates. Agreeable to your request by Mr. Kirkland, I have convened the Indians of this town on Friday last, that would be, doing the math, the 22nd of August, beginning the day after their return from Bennington, for which place they set out too late to reap any of the glory of our late victory there. After 4 days' usual delay, about 14 or 15 proposed to go with this to wait upon you and receive your directions. I furnished them with provisions to carry them to Albany and some ammunition. I am, dear sir, with much affection, your most humble servant, Timothy Edwards. So we actually have someone in charge of mobilizing these men, saying, sorry, they weren't there. So you can understand as Western Massachusetts began to take more pride in their very notable contributions in the battle and trying to build up their numbers on paper as to how many actually turned out for the alarm, why the Stockbridge Native Americans would have been lumped in there. So, to conclude, I mentioned, we do a few myths in detail, but there's so many. I'm going to provide a very brief survey of a few others. You may have heard these, you may not have. Here we have a Brunswick Dragoon painted. So at the Battle of Bennington, we did have dragoons. The troops of the Prinz Ludwig Dragoon Regiment who fought in the battle are traditionally described as wearing, and I'm quoting from a mid-century account here, heavy jack boots with large long spurs, stout and stiff leather breeches, and gauntlets reaching high upon their arms. This is absurd on its face, but it's another error that is still retold by modern historians. The truth is that the Duke of Brunswick leased his soldiers to King George with the explicit understanding that they would not arrive mounted. They had no horses transported with them. The Duke forbid his men to wear riding boots when dismounted, as you can imagine, right? That would make sense. Furthermore, Burgoyne himself issued orders on May 30th, 1777, that the dragoons were to wear canvas trousers. While it's true they still carried weapons designed for use in mounted service, even these were adapted and modified to accept a bayonet. So, yes, they were trained to fight on horseback, but in the case of the Saratoga campaign, they arrived as fully capable, in a sense, regiment of foot. Moving on to our next myth, we have the Molly Stark cannon there. There were a total of 4 cannon deployed by Crown forces in the battle. 2 3-pounders are accounted for. Actually, we can go see them. If you got in your car today, you can see them at the State House in Montpelier and in the Sloan Gallery of the Bennington Museum. There are 2 6-pounders, however, that remain unaccounted for. So I will own up to that. According to tradition, General Stark is said to have gifted the militia company of New Boston one of the cannon taken in the battle. And it does seem as if he did actually give them a cannon. Today, this cannon is known as the Molly Stark cannon. Unfortunately, and not meaning to cast any undue aspersions, and despite the pride taken in this particular piece, and it's a lovely piece, this also appears to be fiction. The cannon used at Bennington, even though they were manned by Germans, were in fact British field pieces designed for service in the American wilderness in North America for this campaign. No French cannon were deployed with Burgoyne. This cannon has French decorations and engravings. Its bore diameter is consistent with a rebored 4-pounder, so it can't be a 3-pounder or a 6-pounder, the only size of cannon present in the battle. And there's no documentation whatsoever for this being in the battle. I will also, again, a perfectly lovely flag, casting no aspersions, but just setting the record straight. One of the most recognizable symbols of the Battle of Bennington is the Bennington flag, supposedly created by Molly Stark herself, according to some. The story goes that it was flown in the battle itself. Even if this is not the case, the true story of the flag is still quite interesting. Nathaniel Fillmore Sr., grandfather of the 13th president, Millard Fillmore, is supposed to have carried it in battle. In the 19th century, the flag flew during the Battle of Pittsburgh, but during the War of 1812, not the Revolutionary War. John Spargo brought the flag into Vermont, claiming there can be no reasonable doubt that this flag is a genuine relic of the Revolution, However, analysis of the flag has determined it was a product of a cotton power loom, which would fairly conclusively date it to the early 1800s. The shape of the stars is also inconsistent with an 18th century design. It undoubtedly inspired Americans in combat, just in another century. Oop. So I do have a few other things that we could survey very briefly. In addition to another myth of the battle relating to cannon, there's the myth, and this is another largely oral tradition. The cannon hole is one I hear frequently. Visitors will tell me that they have swam the balloon sack and sort of fishing around the banks, felt the muzzle of cannon. I don't know what they're feeling. It may be related to plumbing. I fairly doubt that there was any cannon cast into the river. There's really not a great documentation for that. If Stark had been unable to recover one of the captured cannon that he lists, it would almost certainly have been mentioned. It's not outside the realm of possibility. When the enemy were about to lose their field pieces in battle, it wasn't uncommon to render them inoperable or to in some way deny them to the enemy. Typically that would be done by spiking them, by sort of ruining, at least until a smith could get at it, the vent of the cannon, the touch hole. In the Battle of Bennington, sure, we had a river, so maybe in the heat of the moment you could reel it down into the river, but even then there was still means of recovering something from a river that shallow. So how effective that would have been is sort of open to interpretation. So that concludes this presentation. We've picked apart some falsehoods associated with the battle today, and we've seen how historical fact can be manipulated, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. So in the case of the Witch of the Wilderness, the error seems to be somewhat intentional. In the case of Baum's Gold, the story took on a life of its own through oral history. The Glitch account would seem to be an honest mistake, debunked as history became a more robust discipline. And in the story of the Stockbridge tribes, it's demonstrated how relatively simple error can, again, snowball. So I hope that today I've done my part to set the record straight. But in the spirit of this presentation, I would encourage you not to take my word for any of this. Check the sources for yourself. Thank you.
And you didn't mention where the battle really took place.
Oh, well, I don't know if that's mythical, but that is certainly a common misunderstanding.
Let me see, it's not a bit, okay.
Does anybody have any questions? Anything I can answer?
Well, where did it actually take place? I'm not familiar with that myth.
Oh, well, I mean, I would presume you're just mentioning the
Usyk.
right, exactly.
Oh.
So there's especially for folks visiting who maybe live outside of the New England area, people often conflate the grounds of the battle monument with the battlefield, which, yes, was fought in Williamsack, New York. Usyk.
I like to call it the Battle for Bennington.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
One myth adjacent, and there's so many myths, and as a curator here, I'm always telling people, like, and actually, Rachel's here. I'm going to tell this story about Rachel. There's a myth that the Gettysburg Quarry is where they got the tombstone, the marble for the tombstones at Gettysburg Cemetery in Pennsylvania. It's not. That quarry wasn't opened for 3 years after the cemetery stones were already in place. And I tell people that, this is now we're getting into the wonderful world of gender. I tell people that and they say, oh, you sure? I say, yeah. But apparently Rachel has gotten tells people that and gets some really negative feedback.
Oh, they'll just tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah.
They'll be like, no, you don't know that. And I'll be like, I do work for the town, and I spend a lot of time with John. Sometimes when I mention you, I'll send them here, but I don't know if they've ever actually come here to talk to you.
No.
But I think it's probably because they know they're wrong, but they just don't want to admit it to me. But I've had one person in particular, I can't remember, he was an older guy, but he was very upset because he had read Tyler's book, which specifically, because I read it, and it specifically says that in the book, in the history book, that it was Gettysburg, it was on Gettysburg, but it's absolutely impossible because of the dates that it was. Maybe Middle Prince was used.
Yeah, I think that's my best bet.
Yeah.
That it's a boring quarry. Gettysburg was named Gettysburg Quarry for the tourists, and Gettysburg Quarry is a great place to hike to,
It's
and
great, yeah.
the trails are great.
Yeah.
Because of whoever is in charge of the trails in town. That's Rachel. But Middle Quarry, you can walk through Middle Quarry and not know you're in a quarry.
Well, we're clearing it. Sorry.
Oh, you are? That's
Yeah.
great. So someday you will know you're in
Yeah,
a quarry.
it's halfway done already. So
But it's a boring quarry compared to Gettysburg, which is just beautiful.
yeah, Gettysburg is very dramatic, whereas Middle Prince is very large, but it's more practical, I would say. But it's
Yes.
quite pretty that we've opened it up.
Oh, nice. I'll have to, once I can walk in again, I'll have to
Yes,
go up there.
it won't be done yet, so don't worry.
In the spring, I'll be done.
Yes, it'll be done by the spring.
That's when I can go. Great. But my favorite myth about that's closer to the Battle of Bennington is the Green Mountain Boys, or the U.S. troops, were fleeing the British who had just taken over Ticonderoga. And they were fleeing, they were running away, they were being chased, and in Hubbardton they turned around and took some shots at the British. And that's called the Battle of Bennington. Or Battle of Hubbardton, I'm sorry. Battle of Hubbardton. And there are people to this day who say that is the only Revolutionary War battle fought in Vermont. And it's like a big myth. And that one, I tell people, and they say, no. And then I tell, well, what about the Royalton Raid? And people say, well, that wasn't a real battle. But it was British troops attacking American settlers during the war and taking them as prisoners of war. What part of it? Anyway. Well, my pet peeves. I shut up and turn it to Dave again. We've got great cookies and seltzer. Do you have other questions you want to ask Dave?
Are you a historian? Is that how you got involved with this?
Yeah, so I'm, my title is Interpretive Programs Assistant at the Battlefield. I'm the only permanent staff assigned there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I studied history and education, and bounced around here and